They thought the galaxy called them legends, until their fleet arrived. Part 1. Whispers Across the Stars. The chamber was enormous. It was built that way on purpose, so that every species sitting inside it would feel like they were part of something much bigger than themselves. The walls were carved from black stone, and the ceiling was made of glass so clear it looked like open space above your head. Real stars drifted slowly overhead, cold and ancient and quiet. The Galactic Conclave had held its meetings in this place for 300 years, and in all that time, very few surprises had ever walked through its great doors. Today, they were talking about humans. Ambassador Iril of the Sorvan stood near the edge of the speaking floor with his long silver fingers folded behind his back. He was tall, even by the standards of his own people, and his pale blue eyes moved slowly around the room as the historian spoke. Iril had heard the human stories before. Every diplomat of his generation had. They were passed around at gatherings like old campfire tales, told with a strange mixture of awe and discomfort, the way someone might talk about a fire that had once burned their house down and also, somehow, saved their life while doing it. The historian was a Delvery named Soa. He was small and rust-colored, with 4 arms that moved rapidly when he spoke, which was almost always. He had spent 40 years collecting records from civilizations across the known galaxy: songs, stone carvings, oral traditions, painted walls, written texts, all of them about the same species. He called his presentation the Cultural Survey of Human Mythology across 17 civilizations. The title alone had made 3 ambassadors shift uncomfortably in their seats before he had even begun. The breadth of the Outer Rim, Soa said, pulling up a carved stone tablet on the wide display screen behind him, describe humans as creatures that do not stop. He translated the inscription with careful words. It says that when a human falls, it looks at the ground, gets angry at it, and then stands up again. A small wave of quiet laughter moved through the chamber. Not unkind. The kind of laughter that comes when something is funny precisely because it is also completely true. The Veth colonies near the Keth border call them the Pale Berserkers, Soa continued. This name came from a single engagement near the Callisto moon, 60 years ago. A group of human soldiers held a narrow corridor for 11 days against a Keth assault force 6 times their size. They did not win. They were never going to win. They simply refused to be finished until every civilian behind them had escaped safely. The room was quieter after that. Iril had read the Callisto records more times than he would ever admit in public. 11 days.
No resupply chips. No reinforcements.
No possibility of rescue. The final transmission from the human commander had been very short and very clear. It said, "We have done what we came to do. Tell them we said hello." He had never figured out who the *them* referred to. He thought about it sometimes, late at night when the station was dark. He suspected it meant everyone who was still alive. Across all 17 cultures surveyed, Soa said, his 4 arms slowing slightly, the same ideas appear again and again. Humans are described as emotional, stubborn, physically weaker than many species, and yet extraordinarily difficult to stop. Several cultures have begun placing human figures inside their religious texts, not as gods, but as examples, as proof that something small and fragile can still hold the line when everything behind it matters. At the far end of the long delegate table, a single man sat alone. He was older, with a face that had clearly spent too many years outdoors and hair the pale grey of winter grass. He wore a plain coat with no symbols on it, no insignia, no decoration of any kind, which was unusual in a room where every other delegate wore the colours and marks of their civilization like armour. He had been sitting in the same chair since the session began, holding a small cup of something warm in both hands, listening without expression. His name was Davin Price. He was the human representative to the Galactic Conclave. It sounded like an important title. In practice, it meant he came to meetings where other people talked about his species in past tense. "Of course," said Ambassador Veth of the Krill, from across the floor, his voice carrying the flat and final tone of someone who had made up their mind long before arriving. "This is all very poetic. But poetry does not change the situation we are facing." He gestured at the star map on the wall. The Keth Dominion's territory glowed a deep red that had grown noticeably larger since the last meeting. It looked like a wound spreading. Humanity has been silent for 60 years. Their colonies have gone dark. Their ships have not appeared in any registered lane or trade route since the Callisto incident. Whatever they were in those old stories, they are no longer a relevant force. Heads nodded around the table. Iril did not nod. He looked at Davin Price instead. Price was still looking into his cup. The real question, Veth pressed on, is whether the Conclave's combined fleet can hold the Keth advance at the outer colonies. I believe it cannot. I believe we mobilize within the month, or we will be holding this meeting in a much smaller room. More agreement. The historian quietly packed away his tablets. The conversation about human mythology was apparently finished, replaced now by the far more pressing business of an enemy that still existed, still moved, and was getting closer. Defense numbers were discussed. Ship counts were argued over. The Sorvan offered 3 warships. The Krill offered intelligence. The Delvery offered supply lanes. Everyone at the table offered something. No one looked at Dave and Price, because no one expected him to offer anything at all. He had been attending these meetings for 11 years and had spoken perhaps 200 words in total during that time. Most of the delegates had simply stopped including him in their calculations. Near the end of the session, a young Sorvan councillor named Maeve leaned toward Price and asked quietly, as a small courtesy, whether he had anything to add. Price looked up from his cup. He had brown eyes, the particular kind that come from spending a long time watching things and very little time worrying about being watched. "No," he said. Then, after a pause that lasted just a breath too long, he added, "I'll pass your regards along." Maeve blinked. "I'm sorry, along to whom?" But Price was already looking back at the star map on the far wall. Near its edge, close to the Keth border, a small alert had appeared, a ping from the deep-range sensor array that watched the jump corridors. Thousands of drive signatures, the system reported. Moving in tight, coordinated formation. Broadcasting no identification codes at all. Maeve stared at the alert. Then back at Price. Then at the alert again. Price set his empty cup down gently on the table. He said nothing else for the rest of the session. But for just one moment, when no one was watching and the room was full of the noise of worried diplomats, something that might have been a small smile passed across his tired face. Outside the glass ceiling, the stars moved on, cold and patient and full of things the galaxy had not yet learned to expect. They thought the galaxy called them legends, until their fleet arrived. Part 2. The signal they never expected. The colony of Orai was burning. Not all of it, not yet. But the fires had started in the outer districts 2 hours ago, when the first Keth strike craft came through the upper atmosphere and dropped their payloads on the power stations. The colonial government had sent out emergency broadcasts on every open channel. They had asked the Conclave for help. They had asked their neighboring systems for help. They had asked anyone who might be listening. What answered was not what anyone expected. Keth Fleet Admiral Vora stood at the command bridge of his flagship and watched the planet below with the calm satisfaction of someone finishing a meal. He had led 19 engagements in the last 4 years and had never lost one. He was not arrogant about this. Arrogance was for commanders who had not yet been tested. Vora was simply confident, the way a blade is confident in what it does. 30 minutes until full orbital control, his tactical officer reported. The colony's defense grid is down to 20%. Recommend we begin ground approach in. Sir. Another officer's voice was sharp and sudden. We have a contact. Single vessel. Dropping from jump translation directly between us and the planet. Vora turned slowly. One ship. Yes, sir. One ship. Small classification. Configuration does not match anything in the archive. Vora looked at the screen. The vessel was strange. It was not large, smaller than his own ship by a significant margin. It had a long hull with angled sides that caught scanner light in unusual ways. It moved out of its jump point with a kind of steady, unhurried confidence that Vora found immediately irritating. Damaged ships moved like that sometimes, when their crews had stopped expecting to survive. This ship did not look damaged. It opened a channel. Not to Vora. To the colony below. A voice came through, a human voice, male, calm as a man reading a list. It said, "Hold tight. We are early." Then it came straight at the Keth fleet. On the bridge of the Resolute, Captain Owen Briggs stood with his arms behind his back and watched the numbers on the tactical board in front of him. 17 Keth warships. 2 destroyer class at the front. 1 flagship behind them. He had seen worse arrangements. He had also seen better ones, and he would have preferred one of those right now. "You do know," said Lieutenant Nina Harlow from the seat to his left, her eyes moving quickly across her station screens, "that we are one ship." "I'm aware," said Briggs. 1 ship against 17. Your math is good, Nina. I'm just making sure we are both seeing the same thing. We are, he said. Begin the first pass. The Resolute was not a new ship. It had been built 15 years ago in the dry docks of the inner solar system and had spent most of its life doing exactly this kind of work, going places that were bad and making them slightly less bad for the people already there. Briggs had commanded it for 8 of those 15 years. He knew the sound of every system on board, the small hum the engine made when it was pushing hard, the way the hull creaked in certain temperature drops. He knew this ship the way most people know their own hands. And he knew exactly what it could do. The first pass cut across the Keth formation at an angle that forced 3 of their front ships to break pattern or collide with each other. 2 of them broke pattern. 1 of them was slow. The Resolute hit it twice with focused railfire and moved before the return shots had even been calculated. The Keth fleet reformed. The Resolute was already somewhere else. Adaptive shielding holding, Nina reported, her voice still carrying that edge of disbelief that Briggs had come to find faintly amusing. They're recalibrating their targeting. Switching to spread pattern. Then we stop moving in straight lines, Briggs said. We never move in straight lines. Then we stop moving in the straight lines we were using and use different ones. On the Keth flagship, Vora watched the engagement with growing confusion. The human ship moved differently than anything in the combat records. Its patterns were not random. They were deliberate asterisk, but the logic behind them kept shifting. Every time his gunners predicted a position, the ship was somewhere else. It was not fast enough to simply outrun anything. It was doing something more complicated than that. It is buying time, his tactical officer said after a while. It is not trying to destroy us. It is trying to delay us. Vora had already reached the same conclusion. Then we ignore it and complete the ground approach. Leave 2 ships to occupy it. Sir, the configuration on that vessel. Some of our forward units are reporting damage inconsistent with the weapons class it should carry. The yield is higher than the archive suggests. Vora looked back at the screen. The small human ship was still moving, still hitting, still absorbing return fire in ways that should have disabled it 20 minutes ago. It had taken 4 direct hits and was still running the same approach vectors it started with, smaller and angrier each time. Down on the bridge of the Resolute, Nina ran the numbers for the 3rd time and got the same answer. We are outgunned 17-1, she said. I've checked it twice. You're looking at the wrong number, Briggs said. What do you mean? We are outnumbered 17-1. Outgunned is a different calculation. He glanced at her. Update your math. Nina stared at him for a moment. Then she turned back to her board. She did not look entirely convinced, but she also did not argue, which in her case meant she was thinking about it seriously. The Resolute fought on. 1 hour passed. Then 2. Then the 3rd hour began, and the colony's deep-range sensors, the ones that watched the jump corridors far out at the system edge, began reporting something. The colonial emergency operator who saw the reading first thought it was a sensor error. Then she called it in. Then she read it again and sat very still for a moment. Signatures. Hundreds of them. Coming through the jump corridors all at once, from multiple points, moving in tight and coordinated formation toward the Orai system. On the Resolute's bridge, Nina picked up the same signal. Her voice, for the first time in 3 hours of combat, went quiet. Captain, she said. Something's coming. I know, said Briggs. He was looking at the screen with an expression that was not quite a smile but was something in the same neighborhood. That's what I meant by early. Nina looked at the incoming signatures. She counted. She stopped counting when the number got high enough that it stopped feeling like counting and started feeling like something else entirely. Outside the Resolute's hull, the cold dark of the Orai system was about to become a great deal less empty. They thought the galaxy called them legends until their fleet arrived. Part 3. What 60 years builds. The first thing people outside the solar system never understood about humanity was this. Humans do not handle loss the way most species do. Most species grieve, recover, and try to return to what they had before. They rebuild the same structures in the same places. They reopen the same trade routes. They try to make things look the way they looked before the bad thing happened, because the familiar is comforting, and comfort is what grief reaches for.
Humans grieva differently.
They get quiet. They look at what broke. They think about why it broke. And then, And this was the part most species missed entirely. They build something new. Not a copy of what was lost. Something better. Something designed specifically so that the same thing cannot break it again. After Callisto, humanity got very, very quiet. Leah Stanton was 9 years old when the siege of Callisto ended. She did not understand all of it at the time. She was too young for the full picture, but she remembered the faces of the adults around her. She remembered her mother sitting at the kitchen table listening to the broadcast, and she remembered the look on her mother's face, which was not sadness exactly. It was something older than sadness. The look of someone who has realized that the world requires more from them than they thought. Stanton carried that look with her for the next 50 years. She carried it through the military academy, through her early postings on patrol vessels, through her first command, through the quiet and enormous work of the Sol Reconstruction years. She carried it the way some people carry an old photograph, not because it makes them happy, but because it reminds them what they are working toward. She was now 61 years old and stood on the bridge of the fleet's command ship, the long hull of the vessel stretching out ahead of her through the forward viewport. Her hair had gone fully white. Her hands were steady. She was looking at a tactical display that showed 212 warships arranged in a formation that no one outside the solar system had ever seen before. Behind her, an older woman sat at the Strategic Advisory Station. Her name was Maya Doyle. Most of the galaxy believed she had died at Callisto. Most of the galaxy was wrong. She had survived, badly injured, recovered slowly, and spent the following 60 years doing something she considered far more useful than dying. She was thin and quiet and had the particular stillness of someone who had already been through the worst thing and come out the other side of it. "How long since we last had contact with Price?" Stanton asked. 3 days, Maya said. Last message was routine. He said the Conclave was talking about us in past tense again. They always do. He also said the Keth were moving. We knew that. Stanton looked at the jump corridor readings on the right side of the display. Briggs is already there. I know. He went early. He always goes early. Maya almost smiled. That's why you gave him the posting. Stanton did not answer that, but she did not deny it either. In the engineering section, 3 decks below the bridge, Chief Engineer Sam Coulter was sitting on the floor next to the main drive housing, eating something from a small container and reading from a tablet propped against the Condor housing beside him. He was 47, broad-shouldered, with the kind of hands that had spent most of their life inside machinery. He had been the lead engineer on the Warden-class development program for 11 years, which meant he had spent 11 years arguing with admirals, ignoring sleep schedules, and talking to engine corps when they misbehaved. He talked to this one now. "You're going to behave today," he told it. The core hummed steadily. He took this as agreement. The Warden-class ships were the strangest thing humanity had built in the last 60 years, and humanity had built some genuinely strange things. They were large and very heavily armored, more armored than any warship in the Conclave's combined fleet. But that was not the unusual part. The unusual part was that they were not designed to attack. They were designed to absorb. Their entire hull configuration, their shield geometry, their structural skeleton, everything about them was built around one purpose: take the hit so that something smaller behind them does not have to. No other species in the galaxy had built a ship like that. Most military doctrines across the Conclave were based on speed, firepower, and the idea that the best defense was to not be where the enemy was shooting. The Warden-class ships disagreed with that idea completely. They were built on a different principle: the idea that sometimes the most useful thing a ship can do is stand between a weapon and the people behind it and simply refuse to move. It was, in some ways, the most human thing that had ever been welded together. The Cascade Drive was the other thing no one knew about. Standard jump technology, the kind used by every Conclave member, was sequential. Ships jumped one at a time or in small clusters. Large fleets took hours to fully translate through a jump corridor. This made them predictable. It made them slow. It made them something the Keth had learned to intercept and disrupt. The Cascade Drive allowed every ship in a fleet to jump simultaneously, from multiple entry points, arriving at different coordinates around the target system all at once. It had taken 20 years to develop. It had taken another 10 to make it reliable. Sam Coulter had been responsible for the last critical piece of it, a synchronization mechanism that kept every drive in the fleet locked to the same translation rhythm, so they all arrived at exactly the right moment and exactly the right place. He had written a log entry the day it finally worked. It read, *First full fleet test successful. All 212 ships translated on time. Nobody died. Going to sleep for 3 days. On the bridge, Stanton turned from the tactical display and looked at Maya. When they see us coming, she said, what do you think the Keth will do? Maya was quiet for a moment. The smart ones will run, she said. The ones who aren't smart will stay. And the Conclave observers? They'll watch with their mouths open and then spend the next 6 months writing reports about it. Stanton nodded slowly. She looked back at the jump coordinates on her screen. The system of Orai was 17 minutes away by Cascade translation. The Resolute was already there, doing what the Resolute always did, which was hold the line and wait for the rest of the world to catch up. Do you think they're ready for this? Maya asked. The galaxy. Stanton thought about that for a moment. She thought about the conclave chamber with its glass ceiling and its black stone walls and its 17 civilizations who had spent 60 years talking about humanity in past tense. She thought about the myths and the carvings and the stories that turned ordinary soldiers into legends because it was easier than asking the obvious question, which was not asterisk what were they? Asterisk but asterisk where did they go, and what did they come back as? Asterisk. They had 60 years, she said finally. That's more time than they gave us. She turned to her navigation officer. Begin jump sequence, she said. All ships. Cascade on my mark. Across the fleet, 212 engines answered. They thought the galaxy called them legends, until their fleet arrived. Part 4, the fleet arrives. There was a moment, very short, barely a breath, between when the sensors reported it and when every being on every ship in the Orai system understood what they were seeing. In that small pause, the universe felt strangely quiet, as if it knew something important was about to happen and had the decency to let it begin in silence. Then the silence ended. They came out of jump translation all at once, not one ship, not a squadron, not a staged arrival through a single corridor the way every fleet in the known galaxy moved. They came from 7 different jump points simultaneously, spread across the entire outer edge of the Orai system, surrounding the Keth formation on every axis at the same moment. 212 warships appeared in the space of 3 seconds, each one exactly where it was supposed to be, and the combined light from their engine drives turned the dark edge of the system briefly bright. On the Keth flagship, every sensor board lit up at once. Supreme Commander Orith had been brought to the forward command position 20 minutes earlier, when reports of an unidentified vessel engaging his fleet began to escalate in a way he did not like. He was the highest-ranked military mind the Keth Dominion had produced in a generation, patient, methodical, and very difficult to surprise. He had looked at the initial sensor report of incoming signatures and told his crew it was almost certainly a ghost reading, a calibration error, something the arrays produced when jump corridors were active nearby. He had been confident in this assessment. He was no longer confident. Count them, he said. Still counting, sir. The signals are, they came in from multiple points. The system cannot isolate individual vessels fast enough to. Count them. A pause. Then, 212 confirmed warships. 40 additional vessels, support class, plus an unknown ship type. Multiple contacts. Very large. No matching profile in any archive. Orith looked at the display. The human fleet formed a shape around his own that his tactical brain recognized immediately and did not enjoy. They had enclosed the Keth formation. Not a loose encirclement, a precise, geometric one, positioned at distances that covered every possible exit vector. Whoever had planned this had done so by thinking about where the Keth would try to escape, and then putting ships there first. This was not an ambush, his tactical officer said quietly. This was a solution. Orith said, all ships, advance and engage. He had not survived 20 years of warfare by flinching. On the bridge of the Resolute, Nina Harlow let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 3 hours and allowed herself exactly 2 seconds of relief before her boards lit up with new target data and she went back to work. The fleet's arrival had pulled 6 Keth ships off the Resolute's position immediately. That left 11. 11 was still a lot, but 11 felt like a completely different problem than 17. Fleet is in position, she reported. Stanton is on the command channel. Tell her we appreciate the timing, Briggs said. She says you were supposed to wait at the system edge. Tell her the system edge was further away from the people who needed help. A pause. Then Nina relayed the message and listened to the response. She says, and I'm quoting directly here, of course he did. Briggs nodded as though this was reasonable feedback. The battle that followed was not clean. Battles never are, regardless of how carefully they are planned, and anyone who tells you otherwise has either never been in one or is trying to sell you something. Ships took damage. Human crews ran damage control in corridors filled with smoke and sparks, sealing hull breaches with kits that were 2 steps above improvised and worked because someone had tested them in worse conditions than this. The Keth fought hard. They were not cowards, and Orith was not a poor commander. He adapted. He shifted his formation twice, found angles that cost the human fleet real pain, and managed to land concentrated fire on 2 Warden-class ships in the first 40 minutes. The Warden-class ships did not move. That was the moment the Keth tactical picture fell apart. Every fleet the Keth had ever fought operated on the same basic logic. Hit a ship hard enough and it either retreats or dies. That logic had never failed them. The Warden-class ships rewrote it entirely. They moved into concentrated Keth fire deliberately, placing their hulls between the weapons and the smaller human vessels behind them, and they took the hits and held position and kept firing. Orith watched 2 of them absorb barrages that would have halved his own flagship and come out still in the fight, still moving, their armor scored and broken in places but their systems intact. He had no doctrine for this. No training. No archive entry. There was no record of any species building a ship specifically designed to be shot at. "What are they?" his tactical officer asked. Orith did not have an answer. In the engineering section of the Resolute, Sam Coulter was doing 4 things at once. He was rerouting power from the secondary banks to the shield array. He was watching the structural readout on the aft section where a Keth rail hit had opened a small fracture in the lower hull. He was telling his team which repairs to prioritize and in what order. And he was watching, on the corner of his secondary screen, the targeting data for the Keth's most powerful weapon, a mass driver that had obliterated Conclave fleet formations in 2 previous wars. It worked by firing a single massive projectile at near-light speed, and its only real weakness was that it needed a clear, straight line to its target. Coulter had spent a long time thinking about that weakness. 3 months ago, in the dock, he had installed something in the Resolute's drive core that he had described to Admiral Stanton as a gravity lens. Stanton had asked him what it did. He had told her it bent things. She had looked at him for a moment and then said fine and signed the authorization. She had learned over the years that when Coulter described something that way, the best approach was to let him finish it and find out. When the mass driver fired, Coulter activated the lens. The projectile curved. It moved in a long arc that bent it away from every human ship in its path and sent it on a new trajectory that ended in the hull of a Keth destroyer on the far side of the formation. Then a second one. Then a third. 3 Keth ships, hit by their own weapon, because a human engineer had spent 3 months making sure a straight line would not stay straight. Coulter's log entry at that moment was brief. It read, * worked. Owe myself a drink. **. On the command ship, Stanton watched Orith's formation begin to break. Not quickly. The Keth were too disciplined for panic, but the edges were pulling back. Ships were angling away. The mass driver had not fired a second time. "He's going to run," Maya said from behind her. "I know." "Are we letting him?" Stanton watched the Keth flagship begin its turn. A retreating enemy, pursued, becomes a desperate one. A desperate enemy makes choices that are harder to predict and cost more to manage. She had learned that at the academy. She had spent 40 years watching it be true. "Let them go," she said. The order went out. The human fleet held its positions. The Keth pulled back through their remaining jump corridors and were gone inside 4 minutes, leaving behind debris and silence and the slow, orange light of the burning colony world below. At the Conclave observation post at the system edge, a small Sorvan monitoring crew had watched the entire engagement without speaking. Their senior observer sat very still for a long moment after the Keth fleet disappeared. Then he opened a channel to Verithkul Station. "Conclave Command," he said. "We need to send a message to Davin Price." He paused, looking at the space where 212 ships now held a quiet and perfect formation. "Tell him," he said, "that we understand now." They thought the galaxy called them legends, until their fleet arrived. Part 5. What legends actually look like. The fires on Orith V were out by morning. Not because the battle had stopped them. Fires do not care much about battles, but because the colony's emergency teams had spent 3 hours working through the smoke and the broken streets with their equipment and their tired hands, and fires, in the end, are just problems that can be solved if you are stubborn enough and present enough and willing to breathe bad air for a while. The outer districts still smelled like ash. The power grid was running at half strength. The medical stations were full. But the colony was standing, and the people in it were alive, and both of those things had been in real doubt just 12 hours earlier. Leah Stanton came down from the ship herself. She did not send a representative. She did not arrange a formal greeting or request a ceremony. She beamed down to the colony's central square in a plain uniform, with 2 staff officers behind her, and she walked through the streets the way someone walks who has been places like this before and does not need to be told what she is seeing. The square was crowded. Word had spread through the colony quickly. It always does, and people had come out into the open air to look at the sky, which was clear now and showed nothing threatening. Some of them were crying. Some of them were just standing very still in the way people stand when they have been scared for a long time and are still in the middle of realizing it is over. A Sorvan child was sitting on a low wall near the center of the square. She was small, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with pale silver skin and wide eyes that had clearly been watching everything with great attention. When Stanton walked past, the child slid down from the wall and tugged on her sleeve. Stanton stopped. She turned around and looked down at her. "Are you one of the iron-blooded?" the child asked. She said the words carefully, the way a child says something they have heard adults use and are not entirely sure about. Stanton crouched down until she was level with the child's eyes. She had a granddaughter around this age back home, and she thought about that for just a moment, the way you think about things that wait for you, patiently, on the other side of hard work. "No," she said. "I'm just a person who did the job." The child considered this with the serious expression that small children reserve for information that does not match what they already believe. Then she nodded slowly, as though filing it away for later, and climbed back up onto her wall. Stanton stood back up. She looked at the sky again. Then she kept walking. Ambassador Iril arrived at the Orai system 6 hours later on a Conclave diplomatic shuttle, having requested an immediate meeting with Human Fleet Command as soon as the engagement reports reached Verithkul. He had spent the transit time reading every piece of sensor data the observation post had recorded. He had watched the fleet arrive from 7 points simultaneously. He had watched the Warden-class ships absorb fire without moving. He had watched the gravity lens curve a mass drive around away from its target like water around a stone. He had read the engagement timeline 3 times and found, each time, that the numbers did not change. He had expected, when he arrived, something grand. A command ship built to project power. A formal reception in a room designed to make visitors feel small. Some expression of the scale and weight of what humanity had built and what it had just demonstrated. What he got was the mess hall of the Resolute. It was a long, low-ceilinged room with folding chairs and long tables and a smell that he could not immediately identify but that Owen Briggs, when asked, described as whatever Sam cooked this morning, sorry. There were coffee mugs on the table. There was a small screen on the wall showing fleet status updates. There was a stain on the ceiling that someone had made an effort to clean and not entirely succeeded. Admiral Stanton was already there, sitting at the near end of the table, when Iril came in. "Ambassador," she said. "Sit down. Coffee." Iril Saturday. He had never had human coffee before. He tried it. His expression suggested it was a significant experience. The meeting was not long. Iril presented the Conclave's formal request for a standing military alliance, a permanent human seat at the council table, and full mutual defense agreements between humanity and all 17 Conclave member species. He had a considerable amount of diplomatic language prepared for each point. He was ready for lengthy negotiations. He had blocked out 3 days. Stanton listened to all of it. Then she produced a single folded sheet of paper, handwritten, and slid it across the table. "Those are our terms," she said. Iril picked up the paper and read it. It was 1 page. The writing was clear and straightforward and covered everything he had raised with precise, concise language. It took him approximately 4 minutes to read it and realize there was nothing in it that the Conclave would reasonably reject and nothing missing that should have been there. "This is," he started. "Complete," said Stanton. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the paper. Then he nodded, very slowly, with the expression of a man who is revising a number of assumptions he held going into the room. They were done in 2 hours. That evening, on the Resolute's observation deck, a small room with a wide viewport that looked out at the stars and the planet below, Owen Briggs sat alone at a small table with a sheet of paper and a pen. He had been writing a letter. He had started it 3 days ago, just before the ship left its holding position and moved toward Orai. He had written the first few lines and then run out of time and folded it into his breast pocket, where it had stayed through 3 hours of combat and 1 fleet battle and 2 conversations with the Admiral. He took it out now and smoothed it on the table. He thought about what to write. He thought about the battle, the way the Keth mass driver had curved away like something out of a dream, the sound the hull made when it took a direct hit, the look on Nina's face when the fleet arrived and the numbers on her screen changed from impossible to merely difficult. He thought about the colony in the square and the child on the wall. He thought about the 60 years that had led to this day, and all the people who had worked through them, and the ones who had not lived to see what the work became. He did not write any of that down. The letter was addressed to his daughter. She was 9 years old. She had grown up in a solar system that had spent 60 years making itself into something, and she had never known anything but the quiet and the work and the stars outside the window. She did not know yet what those stars contained. She would learn. Everyone did. He wrote her about the stars instead, about how many there were, and how old they were, and how they looked from here, from this small window on this old ship at the edge of a system that was safe now and would stay that way. He told her that the galaxy was very large and that most of it was, in the end, just other people trying to make it through. He told her that the work was hard, but that it was the right kind of hard, the kind that left something behind it that was worth leaving. He told her to take care of the garden. He had been away long enough that it probably needed attention. Then he folded the letter, put it back in his pocket, and looked out at the stars for a while in the comfortable silence of a man who has done what he came to do. 3 days later, in a secured intelligence office deep inside the Keth Dominion's home territory, an analyst filed a report to High Command. The report contained sensor records, tactical logs, translated intercepts, and a full summary of the engagement at Orai. It was 140 pages long. The conclusion, on the final page, was 3 words. It said, *revise all projections. The galaxy, at last, was paying attention.